When I was young, I lived with my grandmother who adopted me. We lived in this old school building that had been converted into a huge apartment complex. Now, even with me being so young, I remember random things about this place. Like how there was a Coke machine right outside our apartment door that sold my favorite soda, vanilla Coke. Or how the husband and wife that lived in the apartment next to ours always argued. They even would end up in the hallway at times throwing glass plates and glass cups at each other. I genuinely don't understand how they were allowed to live there. I remember how musty the entire building seemed to smell, but the one thing I remember most of all was the people that lived in our ceiling. Let me start this by saying, between each floor of apartments there was small gaps between the ceiling of one apartment and the floor of the apartment above. I'm not entirely sure why they were made that way, but I digress. I am not a carpenter, nor do I have the knowledge of construction crews and such. Most people in the apartments would remove the ceiling panes and store small things up there. I vividly remember my grandmother storing blankets and other light things up there to get them out of the way. I never thought anything of it in my little tiny child brain, mostly because it seemed normal enough. One day my grandmother was in the kitchen cooking lunch for the two of us, and I was sitting on the futon in the living room watching something on this old tube TV. When I say old, I mean old. The thing was heavy, bulky, and the outside of it was made of wood. Anyways, as I sat there watching something stupid, probably like Dora the Explorer or something along those lines, I kept hearing what sounded like humming. Now, another thing you should know about these apartments is the walls were so thin that you could practically hear the conversation of neighbors all the time, so I was very used to hearing mumbling and such. But this particular day, I was drawn to the ceiling tile that my grandmother used when accessing the storage in the ceiling. I walked across the room and stood directly under the ceiling tile, just staring up at it. It was weird. I remember feeling like I couldn't move, and then I saw the ceiling tile lift. Just as that happened, my grandmother walked into the living room carrying our lunch on trays, and it knocked me out of this trance I was in just staring at the ceiling. A few days go by, and once again I hear what sounded like humming or mumbling coming from the ceiling. This time my grandmother was sitting beside me watching I Love Lucy, and when I started staring at the ceiling, she noticed. "Honey, what are you looking at?" my grandmother asked as I once again made my way across the living room, fixated on the ceiling tile. "I hear someone in the ceiling," I said nonchalantly, standing directly under the ceiling tile again. My grandmother, obviously worried, pulled her little ladder over and climbed up it, pushing the tile back and going into the ceiling under just from her ribs down was showing. "Baby girl, I don't see anything up here," came my grandmother's muffled voice before she climbed back down, looking at me with this worried look. And so it began. For the next 2 weeks or so, I'd hear voices or see the tile move, and my grandmother was always out of the room. Do whatever, and she'd come back to find me just staring up to the ceiling. Until one day, my grandmother and I was sitting on the couch watching TV when we both heard the tile move. Both our eyes shot up to the ceiling as tile moved. My grandmother, being the very brave and absolutely stubborn woman that she was, goes rushing over to the ladder and goes climbing up, pushing the tile out of the way. "I don't know who the hell you are, but you need to get out of my house," she yelled as she ascended the ladder, only to come back down the ladder a few minutes later looking puzzled. "There's no one up there," she said to me with a puzzled look. She goes to the kitchen and calls my dad, and as she is explaining everything to my dad and talking to him about coming to the apartment so he could do a double check, I sat on the couch staring at the ceiling. I watched as the ceiling tile slowly but surely started to move to where there was a tiny crack making the between floor visible. That's when I let out a blood-curdling scream. In that crack was 2 eyes. 2 eyes that were just staring at me. My grandmother comes rushing in the living room, and she lets out a gasp when she too see the 2 eyes staring at us from the ceiling. She yells at my dad that we were leaving as she grabbed my arm and yanked my sobbing body out of the apartment. And we didn't go back, not for a few days anyways. We stayed at my dad's house until him and my uncle went and investigated themselves, only to come up empty-handed, saying not a single thing was up there except the things my grandmother stored up there. Finally, my grandmother was brave enough to go back to the apartment, and I remember us coming through the door, and my grandmother went rushing to the bathroom while I very slowly and cautiously walked into the living room. What I came across still gives me goosebumps till this day. In the side of that wooden TV was a skull and crossbones carved into it. Underneath, craved into the TV, was these very small but sloppy letters that spelled out the word leave, and we did. Once my grandmother saw that, she went rushing around packing our bags, and we left. My dad and uncle did another sweep of the apartment trying to find out what was in the ceiling as they packed up the remainder of our things, and they once again come up empty-handed. That building was later rumored to be haunted. That being said, I do have another ghost story that happened in that very apartment. I'm not sure that I want to know what happened in that school for there to be these ghosts, entities, whatever you want to call them. But I know one thing for sure, 23 years later, and you still won't catch me walking into that building for nothing.